Hi, my name is Viola Larson, and my book review is on There Is No Planet B by Mike Berners Lee. Um, this book was published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press, and they actually came out with a new version of this book that's just a little newer. In 2021, they just updated some stuff. And then, so a little bit on Mike Berners Lee. So, Mike is a thinker, writer, and researcher on sustainability and response to the challenges of the 21st century. He's also a professor at the Institute of Social Features at Lancers University. He actually has two other books. His first book being How Bad Are Bananas? The Carbon Footprint of Everything, which is actually brought up like 3 or 4 times in this book when talking about food. And then he also co-wrote actually another book with Duncan Clark, and the book's name was The Burning Question: We Can't Burn Half the world's oil, coal, and gas, so how do we quit? And yeah, and then he also had this book and then the new version of this book. Okay, so this book has 10 chapters, the first chapter just being an introduction, and then the next 9 chapters being on different kind of like things he talks about, like food and energy. So the introduction of this book starts with giving detail on what this planet has gone through in the past and how we have a huge impact on the world. Something that he explains is that our population is growing at a rate of 2.4% a year, which we used to grow at 1% a year, and he brings this up a couple times in the book. And then he also explains that we could end life on this planet with the nuclear technology we have right now, which was not something that was possible 100 years ago. And he brings that up just to show how much our technology is changing and how fast it's changing, and how recently we just got to this point of technology. And then he also says that if we do not change our energy trends within the next 50 years or so, we will be in a much more fragile state, and we need to change what we're doing now so that we're not in that fragile state in the future. And then we also learn about anthropocentrism, which is big people, small planet syndrome. The author uses this a lot to mean an era in which human influence is the dominant source of change of an ecosystem. And he uses this word probably 20 or 30 times throughout the book. And then he explains that we're going to learn about food, energy, and climate change, and that these are all topics that are typically looked at separately, but they need to be talked about all together because of how much they are intertwined. And then he also explains that we're going to learn about how we need to change our ways of living to move into this new world, like riding a bike to work instead of driving, or driving instead of flying, just little things we can do. He explains after every chapter. So the first chapter is on food. So I'm just going to give you a little summary of the entire book. So I said the introduction, and then food is next, and that's just an explanation of how much food we make and how much is eaten, and how we need to change what we eat so that in the future we have enough food for everyone, and how we can become more like productive with the food we eat, and how we need to not waste as much. And he gives ways we can do that. And then he explains the climate and the environment. And for the climate, he explains that political leaders need to know about climate change and be on the efforts to stop climate change, because this is such an issue. We need to have political leaders that want to change it. And he explains how we're losing so many species a year, and how we're producing plastic and not getting rid of it. And then he explains energy, and he explains how much energy a person on average uses every day, and where energy comes from, and how we need to change our energy from being fossil fuels to being solar energy, which he explains solar energy is the best form of energy, while there are other reusable energies, like for example, biofuel and or wind energy, but no other energies are as useful as solar energy. And then he goes on to travel and transportation, and he explains that in the future our travel needs to be cut down, and we need to stop using planes, or at least use less planes. And we need to not use diesel, because diesel is the worst energy, is the worst form of transportation out of all of the transportation in the world. And then he goes on to explain growth money and matrix, and that people, everything grows. People, our carbon emissions grows, our GDP grows. And he explains GDP and how people rely on that to say how good a country is, when that's not something we should rely on, because money isn't everything. You can be really happy and not have money. And then he goes on to people and work, and he explains that hopefully in the future people will get paid without working. And he says this would be okay because people will still work, and people will work for money still, but they'll work for money that goes towards trips and fun things instead of feeding you and for housing. And he said people will still work because people feel the need, or feel a need to be needed. Yeah. And like being useful and stuff. So then he goes on to say businesses and technology, and he explains that our technology is getting way better over the years, and organizations use technology to better jobs and stuff. And yeah, and then he goes on to values, truth, and trust. And values and truth and trust are things that we need in the future. We need values. He says our 3 values we need in the future are all people are inherently equal, this including race, sexuality, class, nationality, religion, and anything else you can mention. The second value being respect and care for the world, and then the third being respect for truth. And he says these are needed for us to be able to go towards everything else he wrote in the book. And then truth and trust are something we need in the future, because later when we go towards solar energy, we have to make sure that the people at the top aren't just taking it all for them. We have to trust them, and when they say stuff, we have to take it as the truth, and they have to be telling the truth when they promise stuff to us. So then he goes into the conclusion at the end, and these are thinking skills. It's conclusion, thinking skills for today's world. And he explains thinking skills that we need in the 21st century, and some of these being global empathy, future thinking, critical thinking skills. And then he also explains religion and how people say, actually the final thing he says in the book is religion, and how religion is one of the main things getting in the way, because some people believe that climate change is not real based on their religion. They say God created it, or whatever they believe in is doing these things, not climate change. And he says we do need to work with other people's point of views, but we can't let that get in the way of our views. And then he ends there. And then I'll go into the questions. So the first question is, what are the main objectives of the work, and are they successfully accomplished? So the main objectives of this book was to bring up issues like food, climate change, and energy, and discuss the future of these issues and what we need to do about it in the different ways, and the different ways we can do that, and their pros and cons. So for food, we need to reduce the amount of food we're growing while still consuming the same amount. So for this, we could lower the amount of meat we consume, because the amount of energy we or the amount of calories we get from meat is lower than the amount of calories we have to feed the animal to get the meat. For climate change, this would be like how we need to burn less coal and other and oils and stuff like that, so that our temperature our climate doesn't change, our temperature doesn't change. And then energy is we need to move to more solar energy and away from oil and coal and those kind of energies. And solar would be the most useful energy. And then, so the next question was what worked. I think all the objectives he made in this book worked. I think this because the author went into great detail as to why we need to change and gave good facts and good evidence to back up his reasoning. If you just flip through the book, you can see that he used a lot of graphs. Let me see if I can find one to help explain this. And he explained why these graphs, or like where they came from, and then the evidence behind the graphs. What were the main themes and who's the intended audience? So the major themes were food, climate change, or climate and environment and energy. Each chapter was a different theme, but these were the main three, and the different chapters were based around these three objectives. The intended audience is everyone, because climate change, food shortage, and energy is going to affect everyone in the future. Even if it doesn't right now, it affects some people, but in the future it will affect everyone, because and it's going to be prevalent in everyone's lives. But the audience it did reach, I would say, are people that already care for the environment and want to learn more about what they can do. And I think the people that need to be reading this are probably the ones that don't want to, because they don't believe in climate change, or they just don't think it's necessary. And then, did the author change, reinforce, or cause you any abnormal, or did the author change, reinforce, or cause you to abandon any ideas you previously held on to the subject? I would say no. I already knew most about the issues brought up, but I didn't know about them into such depth. For example, the amount of food created per day versus the amount needed. I did not realize how much worse eating beef was compared to eating vegetables or fruits. I thought the amount of food we fed an animal was the same amount we got from the animal, which is not the case. And he explains that into a lot of depth in the food chapter, which is chapter 2 in the book. And then, would you recommend this book to others? Why or why not? I would definitely recommend this book to others. I think the world needs to start changing, and I think this book explains why and how to do so. After each chapter explains an issue we have, and then at the end of the chapter he explains what you can do to change it, and how others, like the government and local communities, and what they can do to change it. So he gives good examples and ways to change in your life. And then I would recommend getting a paper copy, not the audiobook, because of how interesting the graphs are. You don't need to see the graphs to understand what's going on in the book, but it definitely makes the experience of reading the book a lot better, because it helps you just understand what's going on. And yeah, thank you. Bye.